The next session will be Chris Veasley and Diane Hoffmann. They're going to be talking about some advocacy efforts. I don't know if we can use the word lobbying, but it's really important to be talking to the influencing, yes. But again, these are incredibly important people that are working behind the scenes to get the funding that we all need to do the pain research we would need to do. So.
All right, well, hi again, everybody. That was an amazing talk. Thank you, both Todd and Lakia, for that. So Diane Hoffmann, I'm pleased to be joined by today. She's the co-chair of the Advocacy Committee for the U.S. Association for the Study of Pain. And we're going to talk about an advocacy initiative that we have launched with USASP, the National Pain Advocacy Center, and the U.S. Pain Foundation, and our initiative over the last couple of months to counteract all of the changes that have happened in our own personal and professional lives, particularly around pain research over the last few months. So we, as a collective community, researchers, advocates, people with lived experience, organizations, we have worked really, really hard for many decades to get the pain research budget at the NIH up. And it's still only 2% of the overall research or overall budget at the National Institutes of Health, which is completely incommensurate with the national burden of chronic pain. So we're at a little bit over $1 billion right now per year, and we can't afford to go backwards, right? And one of the great things that's happened over the last number of years is that almost every single institute and center and office at the NIH is now participating in funding pain research. There are incentives at the NIH for the directors and program officers to sit at the same table and to finally go across the siloed walls of different institutes at NIH and work together. So what's the problem? Advocacy always starts with a problem, right? And we're all very familiar with what the problem was. It started in February when the president released his FY26 proposed budget, and I'm going to use that word proposed because that's all it is a proposal. But the highlights for that we're all aware of, right? 40% budget cut for the entire NIH. There was no HEAL earmark in there. He wanted to propose a 15% indirect cap, and also eliminate institutes and centers at the NIH that are critical places of pain research funding, including NCCIH and others. And then he also proposed reorganization of the NIH, which we really don't know much about at this point in time. And then, sadly, terminated the Office of Pain Policy and Planning. And so it was not only affecting the future budget, but also affecting what is going on within the infrastructure at the NIH. And again, the hard work that people like Linda and Laura and Janelle, who are here, have done over the years to really coordinate efforts across all of NIH and with HHS agencies in general. And then, of course, as you all are very familiar with, this, right? Terminated, frozen, delayed, grants and all of the kind of chaos that's gone on. So the question is, what can we do about it? And advocacy is powerful, science is political. And the first thing that we have to know is to understand the federal budget process. As Burl said, let's demystify it. I said, I'm gonna try, but I don't know if I'm gonna be able to do that completely. So understanding the federal research budget and then who has authority over that budget, right? So this is often called appropriations in our federal government. It really is just about developing a budget, a spending bill for the agencies. And there's two separate processes. So the White House, again, as I just said, releases a proposed budget in February. And there's a lot more steps in between all of these, but just presenting a simplified version. The Senate and then the House separately draft their appropriations bills for each of the agencies and subcommittees. And then hopefully they're aligned. If they're not, they come together and do something like a conference to try to get on the same page and to come up with final spending budgets. If you don't do that by the 1st of October, we all hear about in the news, it's going to be a government shutdown, right? If we don't have a budget by October 1st. Congress needs to pass and the president needs to sign a spending bill by October 1st or there's a government shutdown. So something that that you'll hear frequently happens is a continuing resolution. So that means if they can't come to an agreement, then we're going to fund these agencies at the level of the prior year roundabout. So there are 12 appropriations subcommittees that have jurisdiction over different agencies within the federal government. The one that we care about in terms of having jurisdiction over the NIH is the Labor, HHS, Education, and Related Agencies, also called Labor HHS. And so who has control of what, right? And the truth is that the executive branch, i.e. the president, the administration, they have certain powers when it comes to the budget, and Congress also does. You've maybe heard before, Congress holds the power of the purse, right? So they're the ones that set overall spending limits and budgets for each of our agencies, and as I just mentioned, they draft and pass appropriation bills. But the president has to execute, or the White House or executive branch has to execute the appropriations. So they do have influence over the final budget, and they can veto it if they would like. So I'm going to pass it over to Diane to talk about what our joint strategy has been over the last few months and then what we have done.
Thank you, Chris, and hi, everyone. So what did we do? So this all started actually at the U.S. Association for the Study of Pain's annual meeting in the beginning of May in Chicago. And the Advocacy Committee had done a 3-hour workshop on advocacy, but it was primarily focused on how do you as researchers get your information about your research out to journalists, how do you talk about it with the press and as well as with policymakers. But at the end of that, it was the beginning of May, and people had other things on their mind. They were very concerned about the NIH budget cuts, about their own research being cut, colleagues whose research has been cut. So what we did was decide, or somebody from the audience asked, well, okay, well, what are we going to do about that? So there was, Chris was there and a number of other people who were experts in advocacy and who had experience on Capitol Hill. So we decided we're going to make this a joint effort, develop a kind of a coalition. And that was the first part of our strategy, to work together, which was really important. The second thing was to draft a sign-on letter to get as many, to certain members of Congress in the House and the Senate, the leadership in the Appropriations Committee and the relevant subcommittee, and then to actually schedule visits with the policy, health policy people, staffers for these members of Congress, and explain to them why they needed to support the NIH budget and this research, and last, involve pain researchers like yourself and persons with lived experience. So those were the 4 primary components of our strategy. These are the individuals who work together. We developed a strategy committee and we met every week to discuss where things were moving, and Chris will talk about that in a minute because things kept changing. But again, the key organizations were USASP and the Chronic Pain Research Alliance that Chris heads up, Cindy Steinberg, who heads up the US Pain Foundation, Kate Nicholson and Juan Hincampi Castillo with the National Pain Advocacy Center. And then, as I said, we drafted this sign-on letter to all the committee leadership and the Appropriations Committee and the Labor HHS Subcommittee because they're the ones that have the oversight over the NIH budget. And we were really, I think, very pleased to see who signed on to that letter. And this was only because we were able to collaborate with these other organizations. All of us together reached out to different organizations that we knew that we worked with to sign, they would sign on to this letter. And you can see there were about 60 organizations that sign on, and the different types of organizations is pretty amazing. Provider organizations, the American Headache Society, the Center on Alcohol, Substance, and Addiction, Miles for Migraine, the TMJ Association, Tight-Lipped, I don't know that organization, but I really like their name. And so we sent that out, and the specific ask in that letter was we wanted the members of the Appropriations Committee and the subcommittee to protect the overall NIH pain research budget and the critical infrastructure. As Chris said, the Office of Pain Policy and Planning was decimated, and so we don't have that infrastructure any longer. Then to ensure also that the HEAL initiative includes an appropriation comparable to FY25, which totaled $640 million. So we were very clear about what we wanted them to do. So as part of that process is preparing to visit the Hill, we also developed a one-pager. So this is something that advocates commonly do when they're mounting an advocacy campaign. These are busy people, the members are busy, the staff is busy. I didn't mention that actually I was a staffer in the Senate for a year. I worked as the acting director of the Senate Subcommittee on Aging, and dealt with a lot of health legislation. But a lot of what advocates do is educate these staffers. They can't possibly know all they need to know about the various issues that come up in Congress. So having something like this is very helpful. We also put together a slideshow. Basically, Chris put together a slideshow for these staffers that we could either use when we met with them or send it to them afterwards. It had a lot of the information, a lot of statistics about chronic pain. We also wanted to include some things in there that they might be interested in, like how chronic pain affects veterans, people in the military. We also included a slide comparing the capital investment, or venture capital investment in pain versus other conditions like cancer. You can see in the third slide has all this private investment where pain has had very little. We also just included history about the budget and what a percent of NIH budget is spent on pain. The circles over there, you can see the very slim red sliver versus for Alzheimer's and cancer. So we had all that information at the ready. Then we had a webinar for USASP members for pain research. I don't know if some of you maybe attended that, and to tell them how they could help and why their voice mattered and what they could do about it. And the purpose of this was to see if we could recruit some of you researchers to help us do these Hill visits. And we had a call for action afterwards, and we got a few dozen researchers who said, yes, we would be willing to help. And so we, again, tried to bring together 3 individuals for each Hill visit. We wanted to have a pain policy expert, a pain researcher or clinician, and a person with lived experience and or a caretaker of someone who had, I'm trying to figure out how long I can go, person with lived experience. And we were successful in doing that. We then had another meeting with each of those people, the threesomes and the larger group, telling them exactly what was going to happen at these meetings, how we were going to prepare for it. Then the policy experts reached out. We sent emails to all the Hill staffers that we wanted to meet with. We did the research on who they were and got their email addresses. We sent them emails asking for about 30 minutes of their time and who we represented, and that this was actually a follow-up to the sign-on letter that they received. And then we did a little bit of research about each legislator, about each congressperson, because that's important to know a little bit about their interests, and is there any way that we can make their interests align with ours. And then we met with different members, and the circled individuals are who we met with. We're still actually trying to follow up. We didn't meet with the members themselves. As I said, we met with their staffers. I'm not going to read all these for time reasons. This is the first slide was the Senate side. This is the House side. And then those were the subcommittee members, and then we also we did meet really with staff for all the leadership of the Appropriations Committee. And these were the pain researchers who participated in the Hill visits. There were about 14 of them. Again, I'm not going to name them, but you may recognize some of them. And also persons with lived experience. We had about 10 individuals who participated, and this was a very effective process to have both the researcher and the persons with lived experience.
I think we should adopt your strategy of setting the timer for all science meetings. Make everybody do it when they get up here. So I'm sure you're curious, what did we hear? What's been the result from this? Well, first, even with Republican members, generally, there was very strong bipartisan support for maintaining the NIH budget. We didn't hear anything about cutting the budget by 40% or even a fraction of that amount, although, not all of them are going to be completely transparent with us on these types of meetings, right? But in general, they are very supportive of the NIH and wanted to see it continue in its current state. There was strong support for pain research in general, and also, Congress still is very concerned about developing non-opioid pain alternatives. So this we heard over and over again, and there was a lot of support for the HEAL initiative as a result of that. Some perceived the president's budget as merely a proposal, and others looked at it more of like a policy framework by which they would start negotiating. So someone starts high, someone starts low, and we meet in the middle kind of thing. We did hear that it was unlikely that the NIH reorganization of institutes and centers would happen through the appropriations process. And then there was a subgroup of congressional members and others who were starting to work on new models for calculating indirect costs that wouldn't just put a flat 15%. So what's happened since? You probably saw in the news on the 31st, the full Appropriations Committee, so not the subcommittee, but the full committee met to mark up or basically talk about and vote on this bill. Not only was there not a decrease or a flat line, they suggested a $400 million increase for NIH over FY25 numbers. The HEAL earmark was in there at the same level that it was for 2025. There was a specific language directing the NIH not to change any indirect cost calculations. And then also a directive against this forward funding of multi-year grants, which would significantly decrease the pay line at NIH. So they were definitely on top of it. You may have seen this in the press and in Nature that they said Congress has your back for scientists who are wondering if there's going to be an NIH at the end of this Appropriations Committee. So there's very strong support from leadership. On the House side, they delayed the markup of this particular bill until after August recess. They were supposed to do it the third week of July, but they're now going to do it hopefully in the beginning of September. But they did release top-line spending limits for all of labor HHS, right? So it's not for each agency in particular, like NIH or CDC, but the top-line number was very similar to what we saw last year. So it is possible that you could take away 40% from one agency underneath that of HHS and give it to a different one, but seems pretty improbable. And if there was going to be that big of a cut to NIH, we likely would have seen it more reflected in the top-line numbers. Now, having said that, anything can change between now and then, so don't say, well, she said that, no. Nope. So what's next? So we have completed these 20 meetings. We're still meeting with a few other people. We've met with almost every Republican member of all the committees. So we're waiting on the House markup. As I said before, Senate does their own, the House does their own, and then they compare and contrast, and then they work it out in conference. And as I mentioned, we have to have a bill by October 1st to prevent the government shutdown. So there's a few possible scenarios. One is that, everything is great and the House and Senate agree on this budget and, we all sing Kumbaya and they pass the appropriations bill, right? Exact, that's what I'm hoping for, bro. The other one is that the House releases a very different looking appropriations bill for labor HHS, and they're gonna have to duke it out in conference and figure out what stays and what goes. The thing we're most concerned about is intervention by the executive branch. We already saw some funny business a couple weeks ago about an asterisk or footnote about holding $15 billion of funding and from the NIH to be able to release that. So there are things the executive branch can do, and they may very likely do to circumvent Congress if they don't like what they see. But the point here is that our advocacy, we got it, like we're ears to the ground as much as we can. And our advocacy, as Diane mentioned, we're meeting on a weekly basis, so our strategy will alter depending on what happens. So what can you do? Please volunteer for these virtual visits if you have the capacity to do it, especially if you live in states where these key members are. And now we're focused on the House because the Senate has already passed the bill. One great thing you could do, it doesn't matter if you live in their state or not, you're a citizen of the United States, send a thank you note to the Senate committee telling them who you are and how much you appreciate what they're doing. They like to hear that as well. You can send a letter or an email. Again, the focus is on the House committees at this point in time, and also consider within your own organizations and communities hosting a call to action. The U.S. Pain Foundation also has a letter writing campaign open, so you can visit their website as well. If you live, it'll tell you whether you live in one of the key districts from these members that are on the committees, and you can draft a letter from there. And also, please reach out to either Diane or I, or the USASP also has an advocacy hub on their website now. There isn't a way to reach out through that, but you can always reach out to the leadership of USASP as well. And with that, thank you.